Once upon a time in the WWE, there was a cowboy named Lance Cade who had everything to become the worthy successor of Shawn Michaels, his idol since he was a child. He was excellent in the ring, he had the physique of a star, he worked hard, but his demons dragged him into a hellish spiral that made his life one of pro wrestling's biggest tragedies. It is an honor to meet you on the Wrestling Paradise to present this new series in 3 episodes about the life of Lance Cade, a wrestler with tremendous potential who left us much too soon. You will learn, among other things, the memorable sentence that Shawn Michaels said when he saw him train at his school, how a beautiful friendship was born between Trevor Murdoch and him when they became a tag team in the Stamford Federation, but also the surreal reasons why Vince McMahon didn't put them on television, how Lance Cade handled the problem of steroids, how a crazy exchange between a producer and him about John Cena almost cost him his job, and even how, with Umaga, they discovered the corpse of one of their colleagues. And you will never guess how Murdoch and him saved Randy Orton's life in a hotel in Ireland. You are on the Wrestling Paradise, once upon a time the cowboy Lance Cade, a raw talent with a tragic fate, Episode 1, here we go. It is October 6, 2008. In the ring, Lance Cade confronts the man who taught him pro wrestling at his school in San Antonio, Texas, the one who has been his mentor and his idol since his earliest childhood, the Heartbreak Kid, Shawn Michaels. What could have become the most important match of Lance's career turned into a nightmare. On screen as well as behind the scenes, the showstopper, who had fought for his disciple to succeed in the WWE, was very angry at him. The spectators of this clash certainly didn't imagine it, but in reality, this match was a punishment. Those big chair shots that Cade was getting to the point of ending up completely in tatters were a message. A last message before getting fired by Vince McMahon's company a few days later, and we can ask ourselves multiple questions. How did Lance Cade cause such anger from Mr. WrestleMania? What led to his dismissal? What impact did this scene and all that it symbolized have on the tragic fate of this man who died 2 years later? To answer them, we are going back in time to San Antonio in 1999, where Lance Cade's story really began. At the beginning of 1999, Shawn Michaels, already one of the biggest stars in pro wrestling history, embarks on a new adventure, the Texas Wrestling Academy. Because of his injuries, he can no longer wrestle and believes his career is over, so from now on he will have his own students and try to train his successor. It's the first day of training. Among his students there is in particular the one we will know in the Stamford Federation as Daniel Bryan and also Brian Kendrick. He is going to make them do multiple exercises, and more specifically jumps, and at that moment he notices a student who jumps higher than everyone else. He is tall, muscular, good-looking with long blonde hair, and is only 18 years old. When Shawn Michaels saw him, he was impressed, and he had just discovered the one who would become one of his favorite students. In front of everyone, he will say the following sentence about this young man: "I smell money." And this young man was none other than Lance McNaught, his real name before later becoming Lance Cade. The one who was born on March 2nd, 1981, moved to live here, in Texas, coming from Nebraska. Now he is more than 600 miles away from his family. He did this sacrifice for a very simple reason. Since he was a kid, it was his dream to become a wrestler, and since he knew how to speak, wrestling has always been the only thing he talked about. This didn't prevent him from doing other sports, such as basketball, for example, since he was already 6'4" in high school. But nothing fascinated him as much as pro wrestling. Even if he was a fan of Hulk Hogan like many other children, it was really when he saw Ric Flair, but especially Shawn Michaels, that he was amazed by the beauty of this discipline. And from then on, he had only one thing in mind: to become as good as them. Can you only imagine that after growing up with tapes of Shawn Michaels' matches, the latter was now his coach whom he saw every day? What was even more awesome about this training was that HBK was very active in his school. It was something that was very close to his heart. For example, even though he had taken what seemed to be his retirement at the time and undergone surgery a few months before, Michaels already demonstrated a moonsault for his student Brian Kendrick. One day he told him that if he did it, then Brian would have to overcome his blockage and do it too, and this is how Kendrick will manage to do his first moonsault after having been treated to a front row demonstration by one of the best performers of all time. Moments like that made training at the Texas Wrestling Academy really enjoyable, especially since Lance Cade also fell in love with the city of San Antonio, which he will never leave again. There, he also had the chance to be coached by Jose Lothario, the man who trained Shawn Michaels and who is even the originator of the latter's ring name. Without this guy, the showstopper would not have mastered his legendary sweet chin music kick as well. He was one of the best in his class there and had the opportunity to wrestle as a team with Daniel Bryan, of whom he will remain the first in-ring partner ever. Together they even had one of the very first matches of their lives in Japan in December 1999. Lance also had the opportunity to be involved in the Texas Wrestling Alliance, the promotion that Michaels managed, where he played a fan who interfered in matches. With his size, Lance Cade had the look that the WWE was looking for. So it isn't a surprise that the official Bruce Pritchard, who came to scout talent at the school, made him sign a contract to join the company's developmental, at the same time as Daniel Bryan, Shooter Schultz and Brian Kendrick, with in addition being mentored by Shawn Michaels. Lance Cade seemed destined to become one of the industry's new big stars. And yet, he won't be, and his fate will be one of the saddest in the business. How could this wrestler have such a fate? Make sure to stay tuned until the end of this episode to find out. At the time when he was in WWE's developmental for several years, Lance Cade was in a dilemma, and you will see that it will follow him throughout his career. His journey to the Federation's main roster began in Memphis Championship Wrestling. When he was only 19 years old, he will be entitled to a non-televised match on Sunday Night Heat as a team with Brian Kendrick against Shooter Schultz and Daniel Bryan on February 8, 2000, in what was some kind of exam for Shawn Michaels students by the company. That happens to be something that many of his classmates didn't like. Being so young and having the support from one of the best even was enough to arouse jealousy of some colleagues. But faced with this, Cade responded in the best way. He worked hard and proved to these people that he wasn't there by chance, and his comrades ended up respecting him. Pete Gass, the former member of the Mean Street Posse, who spent time with Lance Cade during this period, says about him that pro wrestling was all his life, that he spent hours watching tapes. Apparently, when he talked about Shawn Michaels, you could see the passion in his eyes. Lance was someone who worked hard and was very disciplined at the time, unlike others, since he went straight to his home after wrestling to watch matches, rather than staying to have a beer with his colleagues. It was a period when he was fully on his way to become as good as his mentor Shawn Michaels, with, for example, a match against the veteran William Regal in July 2000. He will celebrate all this momentum by marrying his girlfriend Tanya on June 14th, whom he had met in San Antonio. According to his Canadian colleague René Dupree, Tanya was Lance's first girlfriend, and we can say that he immediately got the right one, since they will have 2 children in the following years. Then, from the summer of 2001, he will go to the new WWE developmental, the Heartland Wrestling Association. There he will have success too, since he will be tag team champions 3 times with Mike Sanders and even singles heavyweight champion 2 times. For the record, he had the opportunity to be in the ring with Jimmy Wang Yang and the future Samoan bulldozer, Umaga. Besides, on a sadder note, Lance was with Umaga and the wrestler Charlie Haas when they discovered the lifeless body of Russ, Charlie's brother, in his apartment. In this kind of training center that was located in Cincinnati, Ohio, where Lance now lived, Mike Sanders was his roommate for a year. He described Lance as someone quiet, who sat in his room in front of his computer, someone kind, and who was still very young. It was a time when he really had momentum, given that the officials will once again give him the chance to impress them on October 9, 2001 at Sunday Night Heat, where he will face a certain Brock Lesnar. It also happened that Lance teamed up with Steve Bradley, who was 6 years older than him and who played an important role in Cade's journey. It was thanks to him that Shawn Michaels' disciple managed to no longer be afraid of promos and master them. Indeed, Bradley forced him to do all their promos until Lance, who was a shy person by nature, stopped fearing them. After 6 weeks during which he had no choice but to overcome his fear, Cade finally felt comfortable with them, and Bradley had a lot to do with it. A few months later, there will be more movement, since the Heartland Wrestling Association will no longer be the company's developmental and will be replaced by Ohio Valley Wrestling, where John Cena, Randy Orton and Batista will be trained, to name a few, under the leadership of Jim Cornette. He will change partners again and form a team from the end of 2002 until the summer of 2003, with René Dupree being managed by Kenny Bolin. Dupree said that at that time, Lance had not moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where OVW was, but that he stayed in Cincinnati. So he did the Cincinnati-Louisville trip every day, which was an hour-and-a-half drive, so 3 hours of traveling per day. And since they trained at 8 a.m., he got up much earlier than everyone else to ride in his car, something that reflects his motivation and determination to succeed in pro wrestling. Dupree also revealed an incredible story about him and Lance Cade. One day they were both in the car and getting ready to leave from a show in Boston, at the time when Dupree was part of the Resistance. It was a faction that certainly didn't leave the fans indifferent who hated them, which was excellent for them since they were heels that wanted to be hated. But that day, as Lance and him were leaving the parking lot and a lot of spectators were banging on their car, they heard a big noise. So Cade panicked and rushed for them to leave as soon as possible. A little later, after being able to stop at a calmer place, they will see that the roof of the car was dented and that the fans had thrown a huge stone. They were aiming at the rear window originally. As for Lance Cade's journey in the WWE developmental, we can already notice that the Stamford Federation has hesitated with him, tried several things, needed to see him at work several times before being convinced to send him to the main roster, which isn't necessarily a good sign since it shows that the officials were not really excited about him. However, we can also say that he simply still needed to improve in their eyes. The fact is, they will offer him the opportunity to prove himself in the big leagues with a match on the Monday Night Raw house show on June 22nd, 2002 against Johnny Stamboli. He had another non-televised tag team match with Charlie Haas on November 11th at Sunday Night Heat and multiple appearances on the Raw house shows in the spring of 2003. Looking closer, we can guess a reason behind the Federation's hesitations with Lance Cade. When he met Jim Ross, the best commentator of all time who was also in charge of talent relations at the time and who saw his potential, told him he had to work on his upper body. So it showed that in the company's officials' eyes, Lance Cade may have lacked muscle mass, volume and needed a handful of extra muscle pounds to fit the WWE main eventer archetype more, like Batista or John Cena for example. From a purely physical perspective, the company was looking for larger-than-life guys, and it is possible that Lance Cade had room for improvement at that. And about that we can mention a story that Lance's father, Harley McNaught, told. It takes place at the time when his son was still at OVW. While he was in front of the commentators' table chatting with fellow wrestlers, he was told that he had to make a decision and choose if he wanted to change his body or stay at OVW. And then between January and March 2003, Lance said that he had made this decision and that his body completely changed. In this story, we have to read between the lines. In order to have a chance to succeed in the main roster and live his dream of becoming one of WWE's best wrestlers, Lance needed a physique that he wasn't able to get naturally after years of training, and that was the dilemma he faced. For a few extra muscle pounds and more chances to be like his idol Shawn Michaels, should Lance Cade take steroids and endanger his health or not? In any case, it's a sacrifice that seems to have paid off for Lance, given that on June 16, 2003, after 3 years in the company's developmental, he finally debuted on TV at Monday Night Raw against Lance Storm. Obviously, his opponent had the same first name as him, so they gave him the name Garrison Cade, which he hated but which he accepted without flinching since he was finally going to officially debut on the red brand. Finally, it was time for him to live his dream. And the least we can say about his first match on the red brand is that it was very original. Indeed, all along the confrontation, the legend Stone Cold Steve Austin was on the stage taunting Lance Storm on the microphone and telling him he was the most boring wrestler in the world. Do you realize the absurdity of the situation? Stone Cold blames a guy throughout a match for boring him to death and even brought a pillow and a duvet to sleep. A really surreal scene. Would you look at that? It was in such an absurd situation that Cade debuted and took advantage of a moment of distraction from his opponent to steal the victory. In any case, despite the absurdity of this first match, he will say that he was very lucky to work with Lance Storm for several matches during this period, including not on television because he thinks it enabled officials to see his potential. And this resonates with what his mentor Shawn Michaels told him when he arrived at the Federation. To convince the officials to give him an on-screen spot, he first had to get over as much as possible in the non-televised shows through his matches. That is what HBK taught him. Subsequently, despite the fact that he was finally in the main roster and that he managed to match his body more to Vince McMahon's criteria, Lance Cade will have a new problem that we will guess in the way they used him until 2005. In the summer of 2003, he shortly formed a tag team with Maven, the first Tough Enough winner, before being in a team until March 2004 with Mark Jindrak. In this new association, Cade liked the matches they were able to have against the Dudley Boys in non-televised shows. He says it was at that moment that he was able to experience what it was like to be in an arena surrounded by 20,000 fans who were going crazy and making noise, which was a little destabilizing the first time. According to him, he and Jindrak complemented each other perfectly because the weaknesses of one were the strengths of the other, and vice versa. According to his former teammate Rene Dupree, on the other hand, this Cade and Jindrak team was very generic. They had no character and didn't tell a story. The main highlight of this tag team will be its participation in a fatal four-way for the Tag Team Championship at WrestleMania 20 against Booker T and Rob Van Dam, the Resistance, and the Dudley Boys, Lance's first time at the showcase of the Immortals. And in my humble opinion, it is true that watching them at WrestleMania 20, there is almost nothing to say about them, except that they are athletic. They are good athletes. However, they were lacking in terms of personality since they looked like wrestlers created automatically by the computer in a video game, which really isn't what you want to look like in a big show that is supposed to entertain and provide emotions. This team will end when Jindrak will be drafted to SmackDown, and during the following months, we will see him team up with Johnny Nitro, Chuck Palumbo, and even Jonathan Coachman, with whom he will face Rhino and Tajiri at the Vengeance pay-per-view in July 2004. At that moment, it was too much for the Federation. After a year of experiments, the company sent him back to OVW, and we would not see him again in the main roster until the summer of 2005. So what was the problem? Jim Ross was impressed with his performances, although he thought he needed to improve his body. Actually, everything is summed up by what the official Bruce Pritchard said about him. He told Lance was very quiet and shy and would second-guess and overanalyze everything. He never really connected with the fans. He was great in the ring and had the look that looked like he should be the champion, but unfortunately he just overanalyzed everything. What we understand through Bruce Pritchard's words is that Lance Cade may have lacked spontaneity, charisma, emotions, something that could make the fans like him, root for him. In short, he had to be inspired more by Shawn Michaels, who wasn't only technically excellent, but who also had an aura, facial expressions, a voice, a character. If he didn't connect with the audience, he could never realize his big dream, and you will see that he will soon have the first real character of his career. At that time, he also had to learn the codes of the locker room in a way to familiarize himself with the functioning of the Federation. And we guess it through a story told by the former heel with the cowboy hat, John Bradshaw Layfield. According to him, Lance got in the best seat on the bus one time just because he thinks, hey, there's a comfortable seat on the bus, I'm gonna sit in it. Guys were ribbing him like, hey, that's not your seat. Do you think you're a big shot? He took it as I can't back down because then I show weakness. Finally, somebody pulled him aside and said, hey Lance, they're trying to give you the heads up that that's for Taker, and that's a matter of respect. And when he did, when he realized it, right away things changed. In the summer of 2005, after 5 years of adventures from San Antonio to Stamford, via Memphis, Cincinnati and Louisville, Lance Cade was at a crossroads and got what looked like a final attempt to explode in the Federation. He would form a new tag team with a partner of his choice, either Kevin Thorne, whom he knew from Developmental, or a certain Trevor Murdoch, who had been given this name because they thought he looked like the veteran Dick Murdoch. Lance didn't know him at all, since this wrestler was trained in the Indies in the school of the legend Harley Race. At that moment, even though he was closer to Kevin, Cade was able to be in the ring with Trevor, and he made a choice. He told the officials he thought Trevor and him would work better together. So he made a daring choice, and, at the same time, he was able to get rid of the Garrison name that he never liked by simply telling Bruce Pritchard he wasn't a fan of it. The latter then told him he had to go tell Vince McMahon directly, and, after talking to the big boss, Garrison Cade was nothing but ancient history. A new team was just born, Cade and Murdoch, and the two men would immediately get along well and become real brothers, as you will see. Is Lance Cade finally on the right path to succeed in the main roster? Was he going to find success in the tag team division with his new buddy? Would this lead him to a singles push to eventually become one of the Federation's best wrestlers and thus fulfill his destiny of being Shawn Michaels' worthy successor? That is what you will see in the rest of the episode. During the summer of 2005, Lance Cade and Trevor Murdoch had several non-televised matches to get to know each other and develop automatisms. And as often with new characters who are going to debut in the main roster at that time, they shot several vignettes that were supposed to introduce them and enabled viewers to get acquainted with them. As for these vignettes, we can say that Cade and Murdoch were lucky Lance was close to Shawn Michaels, who is himself Triple H's best friend, who is Vince McMahon's stepson. Without this connection, everything seemed to go wrong. Indeed, they first shot vignettes that were then shown to Vince, who hated them, but fortunately for them, Triple H was willing to produce new vignettes. The Cerebral Assassin saved them from a complicated situation, and the new ones would please the boss and be broadcast in late August and early September 2005. We noticed that Lance Cade had let his hair grow and, above all, that he now embodied a cowboy character with a hat and appropriate shirts. Trevor Murdoch, on the other hand, played a trucker, and we could already feel a contrast between the two of them. We had Cade, who spoke in a rather elegant and calm way, and on the other we had Murdoch, who seemed more impulsive and wild. Their cowboy and trucker characters seemed to complement each other well. With this saloon decor and country music in the background, we were immediately in a very Texan atmosphere, and we also noticed they both seemed to be chewing tobacco, with Murdoch also spitting at one point, which is a detail that we often saw in westerns. We can see an extension of their true personalities, since Lance Cade grew up between Nebraska and Texas, in a culture where cowboys were more present than elsewhere in the United States. Personally, I think it's just too bad to have a tone that was close to comedy rather than having fully engaged in a much more serious Western side, Clint Eastwood style. As for what they were saying, it was quite generic since Lance announced they would soon arrive on Monday Night Raw and that they were the next tag team champions, which isn't very original. The only touch of identity in what they were saying rather came from Trevor and his little moments of anger. For sure, there wasn't a lot of writing behind these vignettes produced by Triple H. However, we will mention that, on the final image, there was a difference in typography between the names Cade, rather refined, and Murdoch, more impactful, a detail that symbolized the contrast between the two individuals. The fact is, this gimmick of rednecks was rather successful for them, as you will see. On September 5th, 2005, they were launched on Raw against the champions Hurricane and Rosie, and from this first appearance they were going to make an impact by beating their rivals. We can see that Lance is very different from his first period in the main roster, with a longer hair, pants, a hat, an outfit with much more identity than in the past. In terms of build and tan, Cade could be taken seriously. And we will also notice a funny dynamic with Murdoch at certain moments when Cade was trying to calm Trevor down when he had pulsions. Look how he kept him under control. It almost looked like Murdoch was the Cowboy's pet. Less than 2 weeks later, we had a confirmation of this immediate and total push for their first pay-per-view match against Hurricane and Rosie at Unforgiven, which is the title of a Clint Eastwood Western. A happy coincidence. The two men were going to win the team title. We must be sufficiently aware of what this victory represented. It was Cade's first title on the main roster, after less than a month in this new cowboy role. This rewarded a team that worked well on screen but also behind the scenes. Indeed, Cade and Murdoch became very good friends during this period in real life, to the point of considering each other as brothers. They had chemistry, and Trevor Murdoch's wife even called Lance the other woman, since the two men spent a lot of time together. Apparently, they even called each other on their off days to talk about ideas they had for their characters. About their relationship, Murdoch said that 90% of the time it was just the two of them. If he got to a town before he did, he would wait for him and they'd get a rental car. If he got there before him, he would wait for him. It was a strong partnership, and not just a partnership but a friendship. What Trevor also appreciated with Lance was that in the ring everything was natural and fluid between them. They were on the same page. Lance understood him as a character and as a wrestler. Where many judged Murdoch because they thought he was fat and in poor physical condition, Lance appreciated his qualities. Cade understood that Murdoch wasn't trying to be an athletic and sharp wrestler, but rather an aggressive badass. The two men knew they could count on each other and, according to Murdoch, they complemented each other well. Lance knew Trevor brought things to the team that other wrestlers couldn't bring. As Murdoch said, he understood him as a character because he was a pretty jacked-up 280-pound gorilla. Trevor conceded to the fact that he's a pretty guy. He knew he talked about him like a gay lover, but he was his best friend. He thinks that the reason their team works so well, and much better than others, is because they got along very well behind the scenes. And yet there was also a contrast between them in real life. For example, Cade said there are many things he does that Murdoch wouldn't dare to do, but on the other hand they had exactly the same car, for example. It is a completely unexpected collaboration that started a little by chance, but which nevertheless improved their lives and launched a strong friendship. And the funny thing is that the official Arn Anderson told Cade and Murdoch that, by their own, they sucked, but that together, their association worked. And they were very surprised to be champions so quickly. We can say that, in real life, they were the same tough guys as on the screen, as we can see in an incredible story with Randy Orton. Cade and Murdoch were at a hotel bar in Belfast, Ireland, alongside the Legend Killer when a fan came up to Orton for an autograph. Randy signed the piece of paper that the individual gave him. Then the fan asked him to sign something else, and he refused to leave until he did, but Orton wasn't doing it, saying that he had already signed his paper and that he was with his friends, that he had to leave him alone now. But this fan, who apparently had some psychological problems, went crazy and became very aggressive, yelling at Orton that it was thanks to the fans that he was so popular, that they were the ones who paid for the tickets, asking Randy who he thought he was. Despite the intervention of security at Orton's request, the fan will come back 20 minutes later and security will intervene again. In the end, while the hotel bar had closed and the superstars were going to their rooms, the fan was waiting for Orton in the lobby so that he could attack him from behind. He came running from behind to hit him. Orton turned around and shouted Murdoch. The latter, who was drunk, turned around, saw the fan arrive and punched him, which knocked him out. Another guy came to fight and Murdoch destroyed him too. What they didn't know was that the fan was at a wedding at that very moment, and that all the guests were in that hotel. All of a sudden, Murdoch and Orton found themselves surrounded by 25 Irishmen ready to attack them. At that moment, Lance Cade arrived, who understood that something bad was happening, and punched 4 men before running with Murdoch to the elevator while they were being chased and returning to their rooms unharmed. Later, they will be arrested for this incident and will have the surprise of being treated very well, since the Irish police gave them coffee and took pictures with them. While Cade and Murdoch were convinced that this story would lead to their dismissal, they explained the whole situation to Vince McMahon, telling him they were defending Orton because it would have been bad for business for a main eventer to be destroyed by fans. In the end, Vince will tell them it was good for the fans to get a beating from time to time and not to worry. The lawyers were going to settle this situation. Later, Orton will say in a tweet that Cade and Murdoch managed to put 4 threatening people out of harm's way in just 6 seconds. That day, without the 2 rednecks, the career of the Viper might have been much different. With such a quick push as Cade and Murdoch had, they apparently generated a lot of negativity in the locker room. Their colleagues were angry at Murdoch for already being champions while he didn't spend 5 years in the WWE developmental unlike others and being fat without any abs. In the ring, they felt these grudges since Murdoch says their opponents often went way too hard with him, although he ended up getting their respect fortunately. Cade was more used to this adversity and had more control over the entire political aspect of wrestling, between constant lobbying with officials and an ultra-competitive environment where everyone defended their interests, something that Murdoch knew much less about. Have they been the victims of lobbying against them? It is really possible, as you will see. From November 1st at the Taboo Tuesday show, less than 2 months after winning the title, they lost their belts to the veterans Big Show and Kane. They were going to be completely buried until they were separated at the end of November and used as singles wrestlers, but without success, falling into anonymity. In just a month, they fell as fast as they climbed the mountain, and Murdoch was disgusted with the company because they couldn't understand why their momentum was killed so brutally. What was the reason for it? One possible explanation is a crazy exchange that Cade and Murdoch had with an important producer in the Federation whose name Murdoch would not say. On the set of their vignettes, this producer was trying to convince them that John Cena, the WWE champion at that time and who had become famous as the Doctor of Thugonomics, was really a thug from the streets, who came from the ghetto, and that his gimmick was very real. But Cade and Murdoch didn't buy it and told him he was wrong. That Cena was not a thug at all, but a common man from Massachusetts. Apparently, this is something that the producer took very badly, and in the next production meeting he completely buried Cade and Murdoch in front of all the officials, including Vince McMahon, saying they were not ready and still needed training. Shawn Michaels, who had attended the meeting, even asked Cade and Murdoch what they told this gentleman for him to be so much after them. When they explained the situation to him, Michaels thought it was ridiculous, but that it was up to them to go fix it. For weeks they had to convince Vince McMahon they were good and that they deserved to be on TV. An incident that taught them the importance of constantly doing politics behind the scenes at the WWE. Another time it happened that Lance and Trevor, while they were watching the show at gorilla position as it is the tradition, went to talk to a screenwriter who was passing by to present their ideas. But at that very moment, Vince McMahon got up because he was pissed at a wrestler who was in the ring, and when he saw Cade and Murdoch talking to the screenwriter, he put his nerves on them by telling them that his new tag team, his youngest tag team, wasn't even watching the show. That it was nonsense, and made them a scene in front of everyone. This is something that really sickened Murdoch, who confessed that in the rare one-on-one conversations he was able to have with Vince McMahon, he told himself the boss was someone hard to know and understand, with whom he never managed to build a personal relationship. Another story involving Vince McMahon would explain their brutal burial. Cade and Murdoch asked the writers why they no longer wrote anything for them, and didn't listen to the ideas they gave them. They were told it was because of Vince McMahon, whom they managed to see in a rare moment when he was alone, eating in catering while they were returning from Australia. They asked him why he rejected all their ideas and what he had against them. At that moment, Vince pulled down his glasses, looked at them and first told Lance, "I hate your fake black hair." Then he looked at Trevor and told him, "I don't like your pasty white skin." Later, after these remarks from the boss, Cade and Murdoch looked at each other and said that he was right. Lance went back to his natural blonde hair, Trevor went sunbathing, and after Vince saw their changes in some picture-y, as if by chance they were used on television again. We will note they both participated in the unaired WrestleMania 22 Battle Royale, which will be won by the Big Viscera. Between the Cowboy, the Trucker and Vince McMahon, it wasn't easy to be on the same page, and they had to fight so that in the spring of 2006, they would be reunited again on screen for what would be the best period of the team of Lance Cade and Trevor Murdoch. In the next episode, you will learn, among other things, how a crucial decision in Atlanta got Lance into a destructive addiction, how his involvement in the best rivalry of 2008 between Chris Jericho and Shawn Michaels ended up causing his dismissal from the Federation, but also the amazing favor that Triple H asked him one day, and even why the Crime Time team was fired because of Trevor Murdoch and him. And you will never guess who he spent the night with drinking in a hotel in Mexico. Anyway, we were able to dive into a big first chapter of Lance Cade's life. It was interesting to see how much he was influenced by the Heartbreak Kid, who is the man who made him want to become a wrestler and who trained him in his own school, a pivotal period in Lance's existence that made him an excellent technician in the ring. But that wasn't enough, because in the WWE, his physique wasn't muscular enough in the officials' eyes and was a problem. That can raise some questions about the importance of steroids to succeed in the company at that time, since there was no real project around him for several years. Fortunately, he ended up meeting Trevor Murdoch, with whom he formed a team of real tough guys, on screen as well as behind the scenes, and with whom he developed a great friendship. It's still quite rare in the sports entertainment industry to see two wrestlers truly consider themselves brothers beyond anything that can often divide them, such as money, power, or sex. On the other hand, we could see they had to learn to defend their interests behind the scenes, since they couldn't only rely on Mr. WrestleMania to help them with the officials. And precisely, after familiarizing yourself with Lance Cade's career, I have a debate for you. Do you think he had everything it took to be the successor of his hero Shawn Michaels? Come and talk about it in the comments. I am very curious to know your opinion, and it will be interesting to share our points of view. We can say that Lance Cade has an interesting story. I hope you had a good time watching this video, and I invite you to stay on the paradise of wrestling to look at some other ones. See you right away.
And that's the bottom line, 'cause Stone Cold said so. What?